Welcome back, sweet dreamer. Tonight on Sleepy Crown, we continue our tranquil journey through the House of Windsor in Part 2, beginning with the courageous reign of the reluctant George VI, who found his voice to lead Britain through its darkest hour and gently arriving at the remarkable era of Queen Elizabeth II, the monarch who defined modern royalty across 7 decades. Before you let sleep take you away, please like this peaceful tale, share a comment about which Windsor monarch inspires you most, and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. Get comfy under your blanket, let your thoughts slow, and allow the soft echo of wartime broadcasts and royal ceremonies to carry you gently towards sleep. If you enjoy these calming tales, we're always happy to have you here in our cozy circle of history lovers. Albert, later King George VI, was born Albert Frederick Arthur George on December 14, 1895, at York Cottage, Sandringham Estate, Norfolk. His father, Prince George, Duke of York, was Queen Victoria's grandson, ruling an empire where the sun never set. Until 1892, George's elder brother, Albert Victor, was the heir apparent, but his death made George second in line. Albert's mother, Mary of Teck, from German royalty, bore Edward in 1894, making Albert, nicknamed Bertie, fourth in line at birth. 4 siblings followed: Mary, Henry, George and John, who died in 1919 from epilepsy at 13. Raised separately, as was typical, Albert and his siblings moved between royal residences, tutored by tutors in Latin and classical literature. His parents, though distant, followed Victorian norms, with George a strict disciplinarian. Albert's childhood stutter, possibly worsened by strict upbringing and forced right-handedness despite being left-handed, persisted into adulthood, though he later managed it. At 14, he joined Osborne's Royal Naval College, a tradition for royals, but struggled academically, finishing last in his class, hampered by health and low confidence. In 1910, his grandfather's death made his father King George V, with Edward as heir, shifting Albert to third in line. He continued naval training at Dartmouth, then sailed the Atlantic in 1912-1913, joining HMS Collingwood as a midshipman in 1913. As Europe's tensions rose in 1914, driven by colonial rivalries and Germany's rise, Albert faced personal challenges. That August, he underwent appendix surgery in Aberdeen, returning to duty in the North Sea, patrolling against Germany's growing navy. World War I erupted in 1914, sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, drawing Britain, France, and Russia against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. Albert served on Collingwood, but major naval battles were few, unlike the Western Front's trenches. His health and stutter persisted, yet his naval service shaped his resilience, a trait that would define his unexpected path to the throne. Therefore, Albert spent much of late 1914, all of 1915, and into early 1916 on board the Collingwood, undertaking gunnery drills and patrols in the waters north of Scotland, but seeing little active engagement with the enemy. Albert was present for the largest naval clash between Britain and Germany during the war. The Battle of Jutland took place over the course of the 31st of May and the 1st of June 1916 in the waters off the coast of western Denmark and northwestern Germany, as both sides sought to score a tactical breakthrough at sea which might turn the course of the war. The British had the greater number of ships, with just over 150 vessels, 28 of them being the dreadnought battleships, the foremost military vessel of the day, supplemented by nearly 80 destroyer-class ships. The German armada was just under 100 ships, with just 16 dreadnoughts. Over 60% of its vessels were torpedo boats, and the German attack would rely on these scoring a number of hits before they ran out of torpedoes in order for the Germans to emerge from the clash victorious. In the ensuing naval melee, Albert served as a junior officer aboard the HMS Collingwood. He performed well during the battle and was mentioned as such in the dispatches, but the battle was a mixed affair. Overall, as the British and German fleets engaged with each other across a large stretch of sea, the Germans ultimately scored more hits, sinking 14 ships while only losing 11, while the British also lost a disproportionately higher number of destroyers and larger battleships, and over twice as many mariners. As such, the Germans statistically won the Battle of Jutland, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, one in which the Germans lost vital naval resources. In its aftermath, Berlin decided to prioritize submarine warfare, and there would be no second major naval clash of this kind again during the First World War. Albert would spend much of the war away from active service, in large part owing to renewed ill health. Early in 1917, he began suffering from a duodenal ulcer, and he would eventually have to have this operated on early that winter. When he returned to duty, it was as part of the burgeoning RAF, the Royal Air Force, which was formed on the 1st of April 1918 as the first independent air force operated by any nation anywhere in the world, a sign of how air warfare had become a central component of military conflict in the course of the war, where at its outset, planes had been used almost exclusively for reconnaissance missions. As a result of this decision, Albert became the first member of the British royal family to hold a pilot's license, while in October 1918, he would fly over the English Channel after being posted to France. The newly created RAF only had a limited role to play in the war in the end, though. By the summer of 1918, the trajectory of the war was clear. The entry of the United States into the conflict on the side of Britain and France the previous year had brought an insurmountable amount of resources to bear against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. In the end, before victory was won on the field of battle, political unrest across Central Europe brought about the collapse of the German and Austro-Hungarian empires, bringing the war to an end in November 1918. In the aftermath of the war, Bertie returned to land and civilian life. He began studying at Cambridge University in the autumn of 1919. He was 23 years of age when he commenced his time in college, but this was not unusual in the post-war years when many freshman students were young men heading towards their mid-20s, who had spent their late teens and early 20s in the trenches in France. He began attending Trinity College there alongside his brother, Prince Henry, who was 4 years his junior. Albert chose to study history primarily, and was tutored by Reginald Lawrence, the editor of the Cambridge Modern History, and an expert on both ecclesiastical history and the French Revolution, though the most substantial scholar to teach Albert at this time was Dennis Robertson, an economic historian and close colleague of John Maynard Keynes, the founder of Keynesian economic theory. At Cambridge, Lewis Gregg, whom Albert had known since his days at Osborne a decade earlier, was employed as Bertie's equerry or royal assistant. They developed a keen friendship over their shared interest in tennis, and the pair would later play together at the championships at Wimbledon. Albert's time at Cambridge, though, was cut short after just 3 terms, as he was increasingly drawn into becoming a working royal in the early 1920s, spending much of his time from 1920 onwards visiting industrial factories and mines across England, as the monarchy sought to establish closer ties to the working classes in Britain, at a time when radical socialism was on the front foot across Europe. Because he was the second son of the king, and at a time when premature death was beginning to decline dramatically, it was expected in the 1910s and 1920s that Albert would never be King of Britain. Therefore, he was given something of a free hand to choose his own marriage partner, a relatively novel development for a monarch's child. Had he been born in the 19th century, for instance, a marriage to a daughter of one of Europe's royal households would most likely have been arranged. Nevertheless, when Albert began an affair in 1919 with Sheila Chisholm, it aroused consternation in the royal establishment. This Australian it girl of the 1910s was already married to Francis St Clair Erskine, Lord Loughborough. Bertie met Sheila after his older brother Edward began seeing Chisholm's best friend, Freda Dudley Ward. The relationship dragged on for almost a year before King George, exasperated by the situation, instructed Bertie to leave this, quote, already married Australian. Albert was not happy with doing so, but obeyed his father's command. His brother's unwillingness to abide by a similar injunction from the king over a decade later would have striking consequences for both Edward and Albert in the long run. In the shorter term, Albert was compensated for ending his affair with Lady Loughborough by being invested with the title of Duke of York in 1920, one of the most historically significant peerages in British history and one which had been vacant since his father abandoned the title upon becoming king in 1910. Bertie's attentions were soon drawn elsewhere in his quest for a marriage partner. Shortly after ending his relationship with Lady Loughborough, he met Lady Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, at an engagement. They had known each other as children, but had not crossed paths in several years. By the time they met again, Elizabeth was just entering her 20s, and Albert, by then in his mid-20s, was evidently smitten. He proposed in 1921, but Elizabeth turned down his offer, fearful that entering the royal family and the public gaze that came with it would result in her being stifled and unable to express her true self in years to come. Bertie, though, would not take no for an answer and was determined to woo her. A second marriage proposal came following Albert's sister Mary's wedding to the heir to the Viscount Lascelles in February 1922, at which Elizabeth had acted as a bridesmaid. She again said no, but further months of courtship evidently swayed her, and in January 1923, despite her reservations about entering the royal establishment, she said yes to Albert on his third time of asking. The wedding was swiftly organised, and the couple were married at Westminster Abbey in London on the 26th of April 1923. Thereafter, they proceeded on their honeymoon, at the start of which Elizabeth contracted whooping cough in what she later called a thoroughly unromantic development. Despite this inauspicious beginning, the marriage was to be a notably happy one by the standards of many royal unions, and Albert and Elizabeth had a genuine affection for one another. It was, in many ways, the first modern royal marriage in British history. While the honeymoon might have been interrupted by a bout of whooping cough, there was inevitably a longer diplomatic tour to be undertaken by the couple following their marriage. It was typical for newlywed senior royals at this time to tour the British Empire, so that in an age before television, the people of India, Canada, and many other parts of Britain's dominions could have an opportunity to see the new member of the royal family. This commenced with a visit to Northern Ireland in July 1924, no doubt in an effort to reassure the Unionist community there of Crown support for their continued presence within the United Kingdom, following the establishment of the Irish Free State on the rest of the island during the early 1920s. A tour of Britain's colonies in Africa followed, taking in Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan, as well as Aden in the south of the Arabian Peninsula, though the Duke and Duchess of York avoided Egypt, where the British Governor-General, Sir Lee Stack, had just been assassinated on the streets of Cairo in November 1924. They returned to England for a time thereafter in order for Elizabeth to give birth to their first child in 1926, a daughter named Elizabeth after her mother. She was the first of their two children, with another girl named Margaret following in 1930. As soon as Elizabeth was born in 1926 and her mother had recovered, the Duke and Duchess resumed their tour of Britain's overseas colonies. In 1927, they headed west across the Atlantic. They first visited Jamaica, where Albert notably played a doubles tennis match alongside Bertrand Clark, an all-round sporting figure who had competed internationally in golf, tennis, and cricket. In 1924, Clark had become the first black athlete to compete at the Wimbledon Tennis Championships in London, a tournament which Albert had himself competed at in 1926, partnering his friend and mentor, Louis Greig, the Scottish naval surgeon, who had served as his equerry at Cambridge in the men's doubles event. Admittedly, they were soundly beaten in the first round, but Albert remains the only British royal to have competed at the championships, having done so when the championships were still an amateur event. Albert's decision to play alongside Clark in Jamaica the following year was seen as an inclusive decision that embraced the wider Jamaican population. It was probably simply more in line with Albert's personality that he innocently decided to play a game of tennis, and wasn't considering the political overtones of doing so at all. Thereafter, he and Elizabeth proceeded onwards to the Pacific Ocean, visiting Fiji, New Zealand, and Australia, before returning to Britain after taking in many of the Empire's countries in the mid-1920s. While in Australia, Albert oversaw the formal opening of the newly built Parliament House in the capital city, Canberra. He delivered a speech during this event, one which was well delivered. This would not have been possible just a year or two earlier. Bertie's stutter had not retreated with the passage of the years, and by the mid-1920s had become a problem. When he had given the closing speech at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley in October 1925, the ceremony had been an endurance test for both Albert and his listeners, with the Duke struggling to deliver his lines. In its aftermath, he determined to do something to confront the stutter which had plagued him since his youth. Thus, although the acclaimed film The King's Speech depicts Albert as having employed him much later in the lead-up to and opening stages of the Second World War. It was actually in 1926 that Bertie first began working with Lionel Logue, an Australian former stage actor turned speech and language therapist. Logue's methods were unusual by the standards of the 1920s, and he was considered a quack by many in the medical community. But his regimen of daily vocal exercises and conscious relaxing of the throat muscles proved enormously successful in Albert's case. Already, when he had opened the Parliament House in Canberra in 1927, the Duke's speech was much improved, and his voice did not falter on that occasion. He continued to work with Logue intermittently over the next 20 years, and in 1937, at the time of his coronation, he honoured the Australian by making him a member of the Royal Victorian Order, with promotion to the rank of Commander in 1944 more. Broadly, Albert grew into himself in the 1920s. He was a changed man following his marriage and after becoming a father, and unlike his own father and grandfather, his parenting style was a warm, modern one, rather than being a cold, distant presence in his daughters' lives. The family originally lived at White Lodge in Richmond Park in London, but they moved to a more modest home in Piccadilly in 1926. During these years, the Duke and Duchess became known for their philanthropy. Bertie, for instance, founded the Industrial Welfare Society, through which he met with trade unionists and other leaders of industrial workers to try to gain a greater understanding of the material existences of Britain's workers and how their lot could be improved at a time when industrial communities in much of England and Scotland still suffered from striking deprivation. Bertie became known as the foreman to his family. Such was his interest in labour issues. He also established the Duke of York's camps, through which boys from working-class communities and public schools competed in a wide range of events. These were a forerunner of the Duke of Edinburgh Awards, latterly established by his son-in-law, Albert, took a great personal interest in them and attended the camps every year in the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s, except for 1934 when he was ill. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Albert and Elizabeth must surely have believed that their lives would continue on the same trajectory as they had been on since their marriage. They would continue to play prominent roles in representing the royal family as Duke and Duchess of York. But the assumption was there that Bertie's older brother Edward would eventually marry, become king, produce an heir, and the royal line would continue through his family. However, by the early 1930s, it was imperative for Edward to marry at some point, as he neared his 40th year. It was worrying for both the king and the government to discover in the course of the mid-1930s that Edward's attentions had actually landed on Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee who had come to England following her marriage in 1928 to Ernest Aldrich Simpson, an American businessman with extensive dealings in England. Edward and she had first met in 1932 and gradually entered into an extramarital affair. By 1935, when King George sanctioned the Metropolitan Police Special Branch to begin monitoring Simpson's movements, the relationship between her and the heir to the throne had become a matter of considerable concern to the royal family and the Conservative Party Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, when he entered government that summer. Although news of the affair had not become public knowledge at that time, it was widely believed that if it did, it would become a cause of major scandal, both because Simpson was a divorcee at a time when divorce still carried considerable social stigma, and also because Edward and she were romantically involved while Wallis was still married to her second husband. The affair would soon change the course of Albert's life. Albert's father, King George V, died on the 20th of January 1936, in large part owing to a lung condition exacerbated by lifelong chain smoking, underlying medical conditions and habits, which were shared by his sons and which plagued their later lives as well. He had been considerably ill since the mid-1920s, but by 1935, matters were very poor indeed. In his final months, he had expressed his hopes that if Edward continued with his relationship with Simpson, they would not have children, and that the way would soon be clear for Albert to succeed to the throne one day. That would come sooner rather than later. Although Edward immediately ascended to the throne as King Edward V following his father's death in January 1936, there were discussions taking place immediately within Baldwin's government about what course should be followed if Edward insisted on marrying Simpson. As Edward did not have any children, Albert was necessarily part of these discussions from their inception, as he was next in line to the throne. It was clear that if Edward were forced to abdicate, Albert would almost certainly succeed him, although there were rumours in the mid to late 1930s that the government was considering the possibility of one of Albert's two younger brothers, Prince Henry and Prince George, as possible candidates to succeed Edward if the crisis deepened. George, it was held at the time, was viewed in particular as a possible king, as he and his wife, Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, had become parents to a son, Prince Edward, in October 1935, and thus he would have a male heir already if he became king. However, there is no evidence to suggest that the idea of Henry or George succeeding Edward was ever seriously entertained by Baldwin's government, and the plan from the very start of the abdication crisis was for Albert to succeed his brother if Edward ended up renouncing his throne. Edward's coronation was planned for the 12th of May 1937. He would not remain as king long enough for it to be held, though. The first months of his reign saw a growing standoff with Baldwin concerning his relationship with Wallis Simpson. Edward was seemingly determined to marry her, and for her part, Wallis was taking steps to divorce her second husband in advance of marrying Edward. She had informed friends that she expected to be crowned as queen the day that Edward was crowned as king. This would not be the case. Baldwin was utterly opposed to Edward's proposed marriage, and in the autumn of 1936 began liaising extensively with the wider royal family, particularly Bertie, who was reluctantly acclimatizing himself to the reality of succeeding his brother within a matter of weeks, a development which he had no desire to see occurring. News of the affair eventually broke, and it was made known to the nation in the newspapers on the 2nd of December 1936. Thereafter, despite efforts by some senior members of Parliament, such as Winston Churchill, to support Edward's right to marry whom he pleased, it became abundantly clear that Parliament sided with Baldwin's approach. Pressured into making a swift decision, Edward agreed to abdicate rather than end his relationship with Simpson. He did so on the 11th of December, upon which Albert succeeded as King of Britain and Emperor of India, taking the regnal name George, fix in honour of his father. He was a reluctant king and later revealed that when he had to visit his mother and tell her the news of the abdication and his assumption of the throne, he wept. George rose to the position of king well. His style of rule was modest and undramatic, in stark contrast to the controversy and drama which had surrounded Edward as Prince of Wales and during his brief time as king. Over the next 15 or so years, he would fulfill the role of monarch, and its constitutional remit very well, rarely exceeding the role which the monarchy was largely confined to by the middle of the 20th century, which was to represent the royal establishment well and act in a ceremonial capacity. Nevertheless, this was still an important function, particularly so when Britain entered a period of extreme hardship from the autumn of 1939 onwards. Moreover, George's modest and unassuming personality was a good foil to the larger-than-life character of Winston Churchill as Prime Minister when war would come just a few years into his reign. Politically, George was conservative in his views, but not staunchly so, and was well suited to overseeing the gradual modernization of the country, both socially and culturally. George had come to power at a time when the political map of Europe was in flux. Following the end of the First World War in 1918, the continent had experienced 5 years of brutal revolutions and civil wars in regions like Russia, Turkey, Poland, Ireland, and Germany. But eventually, in 1923 and 1924, the chaos subsided, and several years of major economic growth and prosperity followed. This was checked by the Wall Street crash in the autumn of 1929 and the Great Depression, which followed. As renewed political turmoil arose across Europe, many countries turned to more extreme politics. In Central Europe, in particular, far-right, nationalist and fascist parties had emerged to claim power in countries like Austria, Hungary, and above all Germany, where the Nazis led by Adolf Hitler seized power early in 1933. Conversely, Eastern Europe was dominated by the totalitarian Soviet Union led by Joseph Stalin. Those few countries which retained a democratic governmental system were threatened by the vying forces of fascism and communism, and shortly before George succeeded to the throne, A bitter civil war had broken out in Spain between these left and right-wing political forces. The task before Britain in the first years of George's reign was to navigate this difficult political environment, preventing the rise of both the British Union of Fascists under Oswald Mosley and excessive social unrest wrought by the political left. And George's task in acting as head of state at this time was not helped by Edward and Wallace's decision to undertake an unofficial tour of Nazi Germany in the autumn of 1937, one in which Edward clearly displayed his appreciation of German National Socialism. When George became king, Britain was at a crossroads in terms of how to approach the German threat. It could begin rearming rapidly in order to deter Germany from further aggression, or try to appease Hitler and the Nazis by granting them concessions, principally in the shape of reversals of some of the more punitive aspects of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end. George was in many ways a favourer of appeasement, but the principal architect of this approach was Neville Chamberlain, who succeeded Baldwin in May 1937 when he stood down as Prime Minister. Chamberlain continued a policy of slow rearmament, while also allowing Germany to re-emerge as the major power in Central Europe. Thus, few objections were raised when the Anschluss, the union of Germany and Austria, into a Greater Germany, was undertaken by the Nazis in March 1938 in direct violation of the peace treaties which had brought the war to an end. George supported Chamberlain in this approach, but in doing so he was actually following the constitutional remit of the monarchy by the 1930s, which was to support the government of the day and its decisions, regardless of whether or not those same policies ran contrary to the monarch's own views. In one instance, and a particularly significant one at that, George did directly associate himself with Chamberlain's policy. Following the annexation of Austria in the spring of 1938, the Nazis had turned their attention to the Sudetenland, the German-speaking region of western Czechoslovakia, making claims to this territory. Eventually, a diplomatic conference was convened to be held in Munich in September 1938. In the lead-up to it, George offered to write directly to Hitler to try to appeal to him as one ex-serviceman to another to prevent war. This was well intended, though considerably naive in retrospect. When Chamberlain reached an agreement with Hitler at Munich to allow Germany to annex the Sudetenland in return for a promise of no further aggressive actions or claims on its neighbour's territory, George sent him a message requesting him to visit Buckingham Palace immediately on his return to England, so that the king could express his immense congratulations on what he perceived to be a major diplomatic victory. The appearance of the monarch and the Prime Minister on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, together when Chamberlain arrived in England, was a striking statement about their combined belief in the success of appeasement. But they would soon realise how misguided their faith in the agreement reached at Munich was. In the summer of 1939, despite the troubled political headwinds in Europe, George and Elizabeth headed across the Atlantic Ocean and visited the United States. The tour of the US was undertaken on the invitation of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, occurring between the 7th and 12th of June. It has significance as being the first time that a British monarch had ever visited the country. No British monarch had agreed to do so since the US, which had been born out of Britain's colonies in North America, had declared its independence in 1776, and even prior to this, no monarch had visited the colonies since their establishment in the early 17th century. The tour took in much of the East Coast, with visits to Washington, D.C. and New York, as well as Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington in Virginia. The state visit was an important one in making the British royals visible to the American public, and was conceived of by Roosevelt as a way of generating support in the US for providing aid to Britain in the event of war breaking out. It was a shrewd diplomatic move, one which did not see US sentiment in favor of intervening in the Second World War when it initially broke out, but which helped Roosevelt to persuade Congress to provide financial and material support to Britain in the early stages of the war. Close ties between Britain and the US would soon be needed, as Chamberlain's efforts at appeasement were proven to have been in vain by the time George and Elizabeth toured the US in the summer of 1939. No sooner had the dust settled on the Munich Agreement and the Sudetenland been annexed into a Greater Germany than Hitler and the other senior members of the Nazi regime began turning their attentions towards further land grabs. The winter of 1938 was relatively calm, but the following March, the Munich Accords were torn up as German troops entered Czechoslovakia and occupied the country, which became a protectorate of Nazi Germany. Just days later, the city of Memel, on the Baltic Sea coast, was annexed after being threatened with an aerial bombardment by the German Foreign Minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop. By now, Britain and France had begun to accelerate the speed of their rearmament in preparation for the inevitable conflict, but they were far behind where they needed to be. The Nazis were aware of this and consequently accelerated their own march to war. In the summer of 1939, their attentions turned to Poland, making diplomatic claims to Polish territory, which Germany had been forced to cede in 1919 as part of the Treaty of Versailles, which brought the First World War to an end. Finally, in late August 1939, a false flag operation was run to make Poland seem like the aggressor in Eastern Europe. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany declared war on its eastern neighbour and invaded Poland. 2 days later, in response to this aggression, Britain and France went to war with the Nazis. The Second World War had commenced. As the King of Britain and Emperor of India, the task fell to George on the 3rd of September 1939 to address the nation upon Britain's declaration of war on Germany earlier that day. At 6 p.m. that evening, he delivered his speech, broadcast over the radio. While Winston Churchill's addresses to the nation during the war usually garner greater attention, George's on Britain's entry into the war was also galvanizing. In it, he stated, "In this grave hour, perhaps the most fateful in our history, I send to all my peoples, both at home and overseas, this message with the same depth of feeling for each one of you as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you myself. For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are at war. Over and over again, we have tried to find a peaceful way out of the differences between ourselves and those who are now our enemies, but it has been in vain. If one and all be resolutely faithful today, ready for whatever service or sacrifice it may demand, with God's help, we shall prevail." George's maiden speech to the nation during the conflict was delivered without any trace of the stutter which had plagued him for much of his youth. Although the award-winning film The King's Speech contains many aspects of George's story that are historically accurate, his challenges concerning his stutter were primarily faced and overcome with the assistance of Lionel Logue in the mid to late 1920s. George did periodically consult with Logue over the years, including during the Second World War. Nevertheless, the film is inaccurate in suggesting that the king only began to confront his stutter in the period immediately before the war. With the onset of the war, there was a growing problem in the heart of government. Neville Chamberlain remained as Prime Minister and retained the support of the bulk of the Conservative Party. However, there was a rebellious faction among the Tories, and many in Britain felt that Chamberlain's position was untenable given that he had championed the policy of appeasing Germany after he became Prime Minister in 1937. Matters came to a head in early May 1940 during the so-called Norway debate in the House of Commons, which began concerning British efforts to open a front in northern Norway, following the country's occupation by the Nazis, but which soon morphed into a wider debate on Chamberlain's management of the war. It became clear that he could not remain on as Prime Minister, but there was a debate as to who should succeed him, with some favouring Winston Churchill, a long-standing conservative critic of the Nazis and appeasement, and others supporting the candidature of Lord Halifax, an ally of Chamberlain's who was not entirely opposed to negotiating peace terms with Germany. George was initially in support of Halifax, holding a grudge against Churchill over his support for Edward and opposition to George becoming king back in the early winter of 1936. However, as events unfolded in the early summer of 1940, it became clear that Churchill was the candidate who could command cross-party support in Parliament, and on the 10th of May 1940, George asked Churchill to form a new government. The case was urgent, as the Germans had invaded Belgium and the Netherlands that morning, heading towards France. A cross-party coalition government conceived on the widest basis was soon established. Though he opposed Churchill's ascent as Prime Minister initially, once he occupied 10 Downing Street, the relationship between George and Winston became one of the closest between any British monarch and Prime Minister in modern history. The exigencies of the war ensured that they had to meet regularly, and they soon bonded over their common interest in the Navy, Churchill having served as First Lord of the Admiralty during the First World War, while George was at sea in the North Atlantic. Things grew from there. By the late autumn of 1940, their formal meetings had been replaced by informal lunches between King and Prime Minister every Tuesday, ones which would often last for several hours, and in which Churchill related the actions of government, while George explained what he felt the mood of the nation was based on his extensive meetings with the public, which were taking place on an almost daily basis. We know of the considerable friendship that developed between the pair in the course of the war, owing to George having recorded them regularly in his diary. It was not always smooth sailing, notably in the spring of 1944, when Churchill had to convince the king that he could not take part in the D-Day landings, not even on board the warships at the rear once the beachheads had been secured. But generally, the relationship was a successful one, in large part because Churchill encouraged George, a naturally shy and retiring man, that he had a considerable public role to play in the war. He made him feel useful, a sign of their affinity for one another would be seen many years later, when Churchill was delivered the news of George's passing at 10 Downing Street. He was said to have laid aside his papers and stated, "Bad news, the worst," and descended into a deep gloom for several days. George's close relationship with Churchill was, in many ways, forged in the dark days of the autumn of 1940. Following the Nazi invasion and rapid conquest of the Low Countries and France in the summer of 1940, the Blitz, a bombing campaign of Britain initiated by the Nazis, combined with a naval blockade of Britain in the North Atlantic, commenced. The Blitz began on the 7th of September, with the goal of bringing Britain to negotiate peace terms without the Nazis having to launch a land invasion of Britain. London was the prime target from the beginning, but George and Elizabeth took the decision to remain in the capital. It was a hazardous decision. Over 1,000 people alone were killed in the city on the first night of the bombing campaign, and on the 13th of September, the King and Queen were very nearly killed when several bombs landed on Buckingham Palace. More broadly, the royal family underwent the same rationing that was imposed on the entire British public during the war years, and the sense of shared struggle galvanized the nation and won George and Elizabeth the admiration of the British people, even as the Blitz dragged on for 8 long months through to May 1941. By the time it ended, over 40,000 British civilians were killed and 2 million homes had been damaged or destroyed, the majority of the damage being inflicted on London. The worst of the Blitz and the naval blockade ended in the spring of 1941. This was entirely owing to the general drift of the conflict. Between the summer of 1940, after the swift fall of France, Britain and the North Atlantic became the crucible of the war. The king needed to be visible during this, Britain's darkest hour in the conflict. However, from the summer of 1941 onwards, the focus of matters shifted as Hitler and the Nazis abandoned their designs on forcing Britain to surrender, and instead turned their attentions eastwards to the Soviet Union, undertaking the largest land invasion in military history. Thereafter, the Eastern Front became the focus of the war in Europe, while after the entry of the United States into the conflict in December 1941, Britain, the US, and the Commonwealth nations turned their attentions to gaining victory in the North Africa campaign against the Italians and the German Expeditionary Force, which had been dispatched there. They finally emerged victorious in the spring of 1943, after which a southern front was opened in Italy by the Western Allies. 12 months later, in the summer of 1944, a Western Front was established with the D-Day landings and the invasion of France. From that point onwards, the course of the war and the result seemed destined to be one of Allied victory. In September 1940, in the aftermath of the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk in northern France earlier that summer, and the commencement of the Blitz and the Battle of the North Atlantic, George championed the creation of 2 new awards which would be bestowed by the Crown. The George Cross and the George Medal were both created in September 1940. Unlike the Victoria Cross, which had been established during the long reign of George's great-grandmother, and other military honours, the George Cross and George Medal were to be awarded to anyone who was deemed to have conducted themselves with gallantry and bravery, be they civilians or soldiers. In the context of the Blitz, when ordinary Londoners, and in particular firefighters and police, were effectively the frontline soldiers in the war against Germany, Such awards were deemed necessary by the king. The George Cross would become the civilian equivalent of the Victoria Cross, the highest military award of its kind. In announcing the creation of the new honour, the king stated that, "I have decided to create, at once, a new mark of honour for men and women in all walks of civilian life. I propose to give my name to this new distinction, which will consist of the George Cross, which will rank next to the Victoria Cross, and the George Medal for wider distribution. It was to be awarded for acts of the greatest heroism or of the most conspicuous courage in circumstances of extreme danger." Over the course of the war, George would personally present the awards to dozens of soldiers and civilians. Those who were honoured included the likes of Stuart Archer, a bomb-defusing expert who had defused over 200 bombs that had landed undetonated in England by September 1941. John Bridge was another recipient of the Cross for his role in defusing dozens of bombs which landed in urban centres across England. The George Medal was granted in similar cases, often to members of the Commonwealth nations. For instance, Margaret Irene Anderson, an Australian staff nurse on board the Empire Star, was awarded the medal for her gallantry during the evacuation of Singapore in the face of the Japanese onslaught in 1942. Back home, Charity Bick was awarded the George Medal by the King. She had lied about her age at just 14 in order to be accepted into the Air Raid Precautions Unit in 1939. During an air raid on West Bromwich by the Germans the following August, she delivered messages on her bicycle to a nearby RAF control room and helped her father put out an incendiary bomb that fell on the roof of a shop. In awarding these honours to individuals like Archer, Bridge, Anderson and Bick, George galvanised public sentiment to continue the struggle against Germany during the dark days of late 1940 and early 1941, when Britain stood largely alone against the Nazi threat. George and Elizabeth contributed to the war cause in other ways. From 1940 onwards, the King and the Queen Consort were regular visitors to hospitals and various fronts in England and further afield. From the summer of 1940 onwards, they regularly visited sites of extensive bombing raids to console the victims' relatives and to meet the wounded. Often, these duties were divided up, with George heading for military bases and Elizabeth touring London's hospitals and those in the other major cities. One might look at these as merely symbolic gestures, but symbolic gestures at a time of civilian endurance were what was needed at the time, and the King and Queen earned plaudits for their very visible public presence throughout the Blitz and the remainder of the war. As the focus of the conflict shifted away from Britain in 1941 and the Western Allies began taking the offensive on several fronts, George often left England, heading to the front lines in North Africa and the island fortress of Malta in 1943, and visiting France, the Low Countries, and Italy in 1944, after the southern and western fronts had been opened. By 1944, the war was entering its final stages, as Germany found itself being advanced on from the east by the Soviets and from the south and west by the Western Allies. George did not play an entirely silent role in these affairs. He made some contributions towards Allied strategy, notably in 1943, when he proposed that the Allies should forego opening a new front in France in favour of pushing resources into the southern front in Italy, a strategy which Churchill was considerably in favour of and sent along to the military chiefs of staff. In the end, though, George saw the logic of opening a front in northern France, and on the evening of the D-Day landings, he delivered a rousing broadcast in which he recalled the grim position Britain had been in 4 years earlier, before stating that, quote, "Once more, a supreme test has to be faced. This time, the challenge is not to fight to survive, but to fight to win the final victory for the good cause." That eventual victory would take another 11 months to secure. But in the end, as Soviet troops closed on central Berlin and British, American, Canadian, and other Allied soldiers fanned out across Germany, Hitler killed himself, and the Nazis surrendered on the 8th of May 1945. On that VE or Victory in Europe Day, George and the rest of the royal family appeared on the balconies of Buckingham Palace to celebrate with the British public the end of the near 6-year-long struggle. With victory in the war, George's role shifted from being Britain's war leader to overseeing the rapid dismantling of its empire. Promises had been made during the war to many interested parties concerning increased autonomy as the reward for helping Britain in its struggle against Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. In particular, the Cripps mission of 1942 to India had promised the Indian National Congress leaders, such as Mahatma Gandhi, that India would be allowed to hold elections and have greater self-determination in the aftermath of the conflict, if it committed fully to aiding Britain in its hour of need. Now, the debt fell due. In 1947, India was granted its independence, and the British Raj was divided up, so that the Muslim-majority areas in the northwest and northeast became the new state of Pakistan, though the province of East Bengal would later become the independent nation of Bangladesh. George briefly remained as Emperor of India even after independence, but the title was abolished entirely in 1948, though India and Pakistan would remain as members of the British Commonwealth. Thus, in the second half of the 1940s, George was overseeing the first steps of the post-war transition from the Empire to Commonwealth, including the 1949 London Declaration, which was pursuant from India's declaration of itself as a republic, and the removal of George as head of state of that Commonwealth nation. George was cautiously in favour of this move, provided India remained a Commonwealth nation, though the episode did see the Republic of Ireland leave the Commonwealth entirely. The further dismantling of Britain's empire would gather pace in the 1950s, particularly from 1957 onwards, when the first wave of decolonization spread across Africa. By the mid-1960s, Britain would relinquish much of its control of its territories in regions like Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and Rhodesia, many of which new nations in turn became members of the Commonwealth. But George would not live to see this. His health was deteriorating already in the late 1940s, though he was only just after entering his 50s. Like his father before him, his lifelong chain, smoking had taken its toll on his health, as had the stresses of the war years. Moreover, by the late 1940s, he was suffering from several circulatory problems, including Buerger's disease, which leads to clotting of small and medium arteries, and which is also exacerbated by smoking. By 1949, matters were serious, and a planned tour of some of the Commonwealth nations had to be cancelled, while for a time it was feared that George would have to have one of his legs amputated. Unsurprisingly, by this time, his eldest daughter and the heir presumptive to the throne, Elizabeth, who was only 23 years of age, was carrying out more and more royal duties by the end of the decade. Matters did not improve into the 1950s. In the 1951, George had to have his left lung surgically removed after he developed lung cancer. He was limited in his physical movements from that point onwards, although the king attempted to remain active, insisting on accompanying his daughter and her husband, Prince Philip, to London Airport on the 31st of January 1952, when they left for a tour of much of the empire. It was the last time he would see his daughter and heir. George died in his sleep a week later on the 6th of February 1952 from a coronary thrombosis at Sandringham, where he was born. He was just 56 years of age. Owing to his premature death, Elizabeth succeeded to the throne of Britain at just 25 years of age, and as she lived to be 96 years herself, her reign would be the longest in British history. News of George's death was released immediately, and the mechanisms for the holding of a state funeral were put in place. His body lay in state at Westminster from the 11th of February onwards, so that the British public could pay their respects to the wartime king. His funeral was held on the 15th, like those of so many British monarchs, at St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Afterwards, his remains were interred in the royal vault, though they only remained there until 1969, at which time George was reinterred in the George VI Memorial Chapel. His remains lie there today, with those of his wife, Elizabeth, the Queen, mother, who lived until 2002, outliving her husband by half a century, and those of his daughter, the recently deceased Queen Elizabeth II, and her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip. George VI led Britain through one of the most consequential periods in world history, and arguably the most significant in Britain's long imperial story. For much of 1940 and 1941, the country was the only major power standing against Nazi Germany and the fascist threat. In that dark moment, the country needed leadership. It is generally understood to have come from Winston Churchill, but there was also George and Elizabeth as his queen consort, who acted as figureheads in the struggle against the Blitz and the blockade of Britain by Germany. He rose extremely well to that occasion. Moreover, it came from a man who was never supposed to become king, his older brother's love life and, to a certain extent, his difficult personality having combined to ensure that his reign was short. He won, and Edward had to abdicate in favour of George in December 1936. When he did become King of Britain, George cannot be said to have been a philosopher king or a particularly forceful personality, but he offered a steady hand and humility at the helm of state, which was fitting for the time period in which he became monarch. Overcoming his own personal limitations, he won the respect of the British people throughout the war, developed a close relationship with Churchill, and managed the transition from empire to commonwealth well in the aftermath of the conflict. Tragically, his physical decline ensured that his reign was cut short and that his last years were spent in considerable pain. He should be remembered as a modest and humble but effective king. What do you think of King George VI? Was it a good thing that he became King of England and that Edward abdicated the throne in 1936? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Elizabeth Windsor, later Queen Elizabeth II, was born April 21, 1926, in London. Her father, Prince Albert of York, known as Bertie, was the second son of King George V, who ruled Britain and its empire since 1910. Her mother, Elizabeth, Bowes Lyon, welcomed her firstborn. Named Elizabeth Alexandra Mary after her mother, great-grandmother Queen Alexandra, and grandmother Queen Mary, not Elizabeth I. Few expected her to reign, envisioning a quiet, aristocratic life. As the Duke and Duchess of York's first child, Elizabeth was third in line to the throne, behind her uncle, Prince Edward, the unmarried Prince of Wales, and her father. Her birth at 17 Bruton Street drew crowds of well-wishers. King George V and Queen Mary visited that day, charmed by their granddaughter's fair hair and lovely complexion, nicknaming her Princess Betty in the press. Raised by nannies, as was custom, Elizabeth spent time at royal estates like Sandringham and Balmoral, or with her Strathmore grandparents at Glamis Castle. Her parents prioritised daily family time, ensuring morning and evening moments with her. While Bertie and Elizabeth toured Australia in 1927, Nanny Clara Knight taught her to say mummy, though Elizabeth adorably used it for others. Reunions were joyful, despite her growth surprising her parents. Elizabeth's uncle Edward doted on her, bringing gifts, while George V played gleefully, once crawling as her horse, led by his beard. She called him Grandpa England, and her toddler mispronunciation, Lilibet, became her lifelong nickname. Her childhood at 145 Piccadilly was idyllic, filled with Nanny Clara, nurses Ruby and Margaret Bobo MacDonald, and playtime with toy ponies and gardening with Bertie. An animal lover, Elizabeth adored her father's 8 dogs, including 3 corgis, her favourite breed, lifelong. George V gifted her a Shetland pony, Peggy, for her 4th birthday, sparking her passion for riding. By 5, she excelled as an equestrienne, dreaming of marrying a farmer to live outdoors with horses and dogs, a love that defined her. During the summer of 1930, Elizabeth, Duchess of York, gave birth to her second daughter and last child at her family's ancestral home at Glamis Castle in Scotland. She and Bertie named the infant princess Margaret Rose. Lilibet was delighted with her baby sister. She wrote to a relative that at first she thought that Margaret was some kind of wonderful dolly, only to discover that she was alive. The next few years were relaxed and happy ones for the family. Bertie and Elizabeth referred to their family affectionately as us four, a surprisingly close relationship for a royal family unit. Bertie's relationship with his own parents, by way of contrast, had been comparatively cold and distant, and Elizabeth might be said to have been the first monarch raised in a relatively modern manner. In 1931, the king gifted the Yorks with Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. After extensive renovation and redecoration, the family used the house as a weekend retreat. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon became particularly attached to the Royal Lodge, and it remained her primary residence for 50 years following her husband's passing in 1952. The Yorks had some of their happiest times together as a family at Royal Lodge in the early to mid-1930s. For Elizabeth and Margaret, the days usually began with chatter and hijinks in their parents' bedroom before breakfast. The girls would spend the bulk of the day either playing outdoors or in the nursery with Ruby, Bobo and Mrs. Knight, whom they called Alla, or attending to their lessons with their governess, Marion Crawford, whom they called Crawfie. There would usually be more family fun time in the late afternoon or early evening, between tea time and bedtime. Bertie, Elizabeth and their daughters became beloved by the British press and the public quite early on. They seemed to project an almost bourgeois domestic contentment that ordinary people admired and with which they could identify. This national perception of their family's character as loving, stable and relatable would come to be exceptionally important later on, when Bertie was called upon to ascend to the throne. Like so many siblings who are close in age, Elizabeth and Margaret developed very different personalities. Elizabeth was reserved, conscientious, and dutiful. Adults who met her were impressed by her quiet dignity and composure from a young age. She was efficient and tidy, carefully arranging her shoes outside the nursery door and lining up all of her toy ponies in a neat row each night before bed. That being said, she also had a sense of humour and fun that were no doubt enhanced by having her sister Margaret as a nursery companion. Whereas Elizabeth was reserved, Margaret was openly affectionate. While her sister was practical and dutiful, Margaret was romantic, imaginative, and often mischievous. There were the inevitable struggles between them as young children. Margaret had a tendency to bite when she was incensed with Elizabeth, who, equally incensed, would hit her back. Elizabeth expressed annoyance that Margaret seemed always to want whatever she wanted. Margaret was also given to teasing, which aggravated Elizabeth, who had a short temper when they were children. But at the same time, she was enormously protective of her younger sister, conscientious about keeping talk of unpleasant or frightening things to a minimum in front of her, and mindful to include Margaret as much as possible. Their relationship would eventually be complicated and strained by the family's proximity to the crown, but nonetheless, throughout their lives, the two sisters remained close and loving confidants. Compared to the royal court, where the monarch was head of the church, the York household was a much more secular space. For most of her life, Queen Elizabeth II cherished a deep religious faith and took her position as the head of the church very seriously. But during her childhood, her parents placed far more emphasis on kindness, consideration, order, and good manners than on religious devotion. Holidays meant large family gatherings, and Elizabeth and Margaret enjoyed summers in Scotland and Christmases and Easters at Sandringham in Norfolk. They received a weekly allowance of £1 each, and Elizabeth saved most of hers throughout the year to buy Christmas presents for her family. Small gifts rather than extravagant ones were preferred, and the royal family still observes this tradition of simple gift-giving today, even after Elizabeth's passing. Even in her later years, the Queen enjoyed the white elephant, or gag gifts, most of all. A recent biography noted a bit of whimsy that sat on a corner of the Queen's bathtub. A crowned rubber duck, a gift from one of her grandchildren. During childhood Christmases at Sandringham, Elizabeth and Margaret often received books, dolls, toy horses, and sweets. Elizabeth kept a careful list of gifts she had received and who had given them to her, making sure to send a thank you note to each one. She also carefully smoothed out and saved the wrapping paper to be reused later, as wrapping paper was something of a luxury item in 1930s Britain. Marion Crawford, or Crawfie as she was known, Elizabeth and Margaret's governess, seemed to think that the two girls lived isolated and lonely lives. She later wrote of her concern that the princesses did not have the opportunity to see or experience nearly enough of the real world. She wanted to take them on many more excursions than were permitted, to ride the tube or the London subway, to play in a public park, to meet and mix with ordinary children. However, such excursions were difficult to undertake due to the media attention that might ensue. The York princesses were simply too recognisable to the London public. It is interesting that Crawfie did not reflect on the fact that Elizabeth and Margaret actually did spend time with quote-unquote ordinary people all the time. In fact, they spent the bulk of their time with Ruby, Bobo, Mrs. Knight, and Crawford herself, all of whom came from working-class backgrounds. In light of this, it seems doubtful that the girls could have failed to absorb something of their sensibilities, values, and beliefs. It had been Mrs. Knight who had taught Elizabeth to save her used wrapping paper, to be conscious of waste and ostentation. It was to Bobo and Crawford that Elizabeth would constantly turn, either to share her joys or her worries. Some observers and historians disagree with Marion Crawford's perception of the princesses as lonely and isolated, while they concede that the girls generally did not get many opportunities to meet ordinary children. They point out that they were permitted to play with plenty of children from their own set. This included the children of extended family members and children of the aristocracy, and while Crawford's descriptions of the princesses portrayed them as mostly down-to-earth, other writers have emphasized that Elizabeth and Margaret were, ultimately, never in doubt of their status. They were, after all, curtsied to by almost everyone after their father became king. And as many children do when they believe they can get away with it, they sometimes did not hesitate to remind their playmates of their right to get their own way. As close-knit as the family was, their social dynamics could be as complex as those of any other family. Margaret's outgoing and affectionate nature resulted in a close relationship with her parents that Elizabeth might have envied. Additionally, as the elder daughter, the expectations of Elizabeth were higher and became increasingly so as the family's proximity to the throne shifted in the ensuing years. On the other hand, Elizabeth had a stronger affinity with other members of the royal family as a child, including her grandparents, King George V and Queen Mary, than Margaret did. The sensible and pragmatic Queen Mary felt a special kinship to her eldest granddaughter, whose personality and outlook on life strongly resembled her own. Members of the family were often impatient with Margaret, seeing her as having a difficult character, distrusting her conspicuous high-spiritedness, her frankness, and her passion. Reserved, neat, practical, and dignified, Elizabeth had more in common with her grandparents. Despite the difficult dynamics that seemed to afflict all families, Elizabeth and Margaret had a relatively happy childhood, and a surprisingly quiet, slow, and predictable one considering their status as royals. The fact that Elizabeth, nor those around her, ever expected her to be the Queen of Britain is evident from the approach to her education. With Crawford, she and Margaret studied English literature and history. In subsequent years, they received regular lessons from a French instructor, but this was largely the extent of their formal academic training in their earlier years. King George V was opposed to the idea of the princesses attending school, and his sons David and Bertie agreed. They believed there were too many public relations pitfalls involved. For example, which school should they choose, and how could they avoid offending other educational institutions? How could the princesses pursue a normal education while being constantly singled out and scrutinized? Additionally, Bertie remembered his own awkward and painful experiences of being bullied at school, of being pressured to succeed, and he was eager to give his daughters an easier, more carefree childhood and to keep them sheltered as long as possible. Although one can readily understand his protective impulse, Bertie almost certainly underestimated his daughters. Even as young girls, they were far more confident and self-possessed than Bertie had been at their age, and both might have benefited greatly from being able to attend school and receive a more varied and challenging education. There was, at the time, however, a significant amount of social pressure not to educate aristocratic women to be scholars or intellectuals. One did not want to be labelled a blue-stocking, a derogatory term for an educated woman who ought to prefer a more traditional female role. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was initially in favour of sending the girls to school, but ultimately came to agree with the other senior royals. After all, she herself had also been educated at home by a governess. Throughout each week, the princesses attended to their lessons daily, but usually did not study for more than 2 or 3 hours. Additionally, the Duke and Duchess of York often thought little of interrupting schoolroom activities in favour of family fun time, a habit that worried the princess's governess. Crawford privately believed that Elizabeth and Margaret should have a more rigorous education, but her position in service to the royal family did not permit her to criticise Bertie and Elizabeth's approach to educating their children. Crawford managed to discreetly bring the matter to the attention of Queen Mary, who heartily agreed that her granddaughters should have the most varied education possible, even if under informal circumstances. Queen Mary began to take the girls on regular outings herself to museums, galleries, and historic sites. In addition to their studies in the schoolroom, Elizabeth and Margaret received piano, voice, and dance lessons. The naturally charismatic Margaret proved to be especially talented in the performative arts. She was a natural mimic with a facility for accents, had a lovely singing voice, and a hilarious knack for comic timing. Famed writer and performer Noel Coward once observed that had Princess Margaret been permitted to pursue a career in the theatre, she undoubtedly would have been an enormous success. Elizabeth could play piano decently enough, but she was far less interested in the arts than Margaret. Interestingly, the sisters also got the chance to learn and practice domestic arts. They had a child-sized cottage playhouse on the grounds of their weekend retreat at Royal Lodge, a gift to the princesses from the people of Wales. Everything was in miniature, but the little house was stocked with every convenience, including hot running water and modern appliances, and even a wireless set. The girls loved their cottage, and the British public was charmed by descriptions of the York princesses learning to cook and keep house, a down-to-earth and inspiring image of royalty in Depression-era Britain. In January 1936, when Elizabeth was 9 years old, her seemingly idyllic and carefree childhood came to an end when her grandfather, King George V, died. Elizabeth was deeply saddened by his loss, but, as Crawford later wrote admiringly, she seemed determined to go through it all without making any fuss. On the day of George V's funeral, while watching the king's body being loaded onto a train at Paddington Station, Elizabeth stood silently while dozens in the crowd openly wept. The year following the king's death was a strange one for Elizabeth and Margaret, and for their parents. There had been fewer and fewer visits from Uncle David in the last few years, and now they stopped altogether, now that he had automatically ascended to the throne as King Edward VIII. Edward's conduct, both before and after he became king, was troubling to most members of the royal and parliamentary establishment. Such matters were almost certainly never discussed in front of Elizabeth, but she could probably sense the tension within her own family. Most of the new king's romantic entanglements in recent years tended to be with married or divorced women, which complicated his new status as head of the Church of England. Divorce was largely forbidden by the Church, except in very select cases of neglect, abuse, or infidelity. Even in these cases, couples were still encouraged to try to work it out, or come to some arrangement, because Edward was destined to become the head of the Church, which frowned to such an extent on divorce. His relationships in the past had been controversial, but Edward's most recent relationship, and the one which he was still involved in when he became king in January 1936, was with Mrs. Wallis Simpson, an American socialite and divorcee who was still married to her second husband while having an affair with Edward, was scandalous by the standards of the time. Nevertheless, Edward was determined to marry her, but most members of the British political establishment were overwhelmingly opposed. Ultimately, Edward VIII would choose to abdicate rather than give up his relationship with Mrs. Simpson. On the 7th of December 1936, the king summoned Bertie to his house at Fort Belvedere and delivered the news that he had decided to abdicate the throne. Although Albert was aware that this was a possibility for some time, he was still devastated by the news. "I'm quite unprepared for it," he later confided to his wife. "David's been trained all his life. I'm only a naval officer. It's the only thing I know about." Though she was deeply worried for her husband and family, Elizabeth tried to comfort him. "We must take what is coming to us and make the best of it," she said. It is eminently clear that her eldest daughter inherited her legendarily stiff upper lip from her family. Less than a week after the abdication, when Bertie returned home from the Accession Council, Elizabeth and Margaret curtsied to their father for the first time. Their darling papa was now the king. Margaret asked her older sister, "Does this mean that you will be the queen one day?" Elizabeth replied gravely and quietly, "Yes, I suppose it does." "Poor you," Margaret said in commiseration. Elizabeth was now her father's heir presumptive. The family had to leave their home at 145 Piccadilly, though admittedly they were moving into the plusher surroundings of Buckingham Palace, the main royal palace in London. Bertie's transition to being King George VI the regnal name he adopted, to establish continuity from his father, George V's reign, was stressful for the whole family. Bertie and Elizabeth now had far greater responsibilities and worries, and it became much more difficult for the family to find time to be together. Part of the problem was simply the sheer size of Buckingham Palace. People here need bicycles. 10-year-old Lilibet observed when they first moved in, referring to those who had to travel between different parts of the palace grounds. Indeed, it was a substantially long walk from one end of the palace to the other, and the new king and queen, with their dramatically increased duties, had far less time to spend with their daughters in the nursery. They tried to compensate by spending as many full weekends and holidays as possible at Royal Lodge, where they could play games, picnic, and ride horses together as a family. But now that he was king, Bertie's work never really stopped. Even on the weekends, he only had a few hours to spend with his family before he inevitably had to get back to his daily red box of state papers. The immensity of Buckingham Palace made adjusting to their new home difficult in other ways as well. The kitchens were about a half-hour's walk from the rooms where the royal family actually dined, so the food was constantly served cold. Many rooms were chilly and damp, some with cracked walls. Some pieces of furniture were 100 years old or more, and the palace had an aggravatingly persistent rodent infestation. Crawford was distinctly underwhelmed, not only by the condition of the palace but also its lack of warmth. "Life in a palace resembles camping in a museum," she later wrote. There was also now a good deal less privacy for the family, who were shadowed constantly by detectives and bodyguards. Such is the lot of being a member of the royal family, no matter how attractive a prospect it might look from the outside. On the 12th of May 1937, Elizabeth attended her parents' coronation at Westminster Abbey and received her first intimation of what lay in store for her as Queen one day. She sat with her sister Margaret and her grandmother Queen Mary and watched the proceedings, at first, with fascination. Mindful of her position as his heir presumptive, Bertie tasked his eldest daughter with writing a detailed account of the coronation, which today rests in the royal archives. Elizabeth was impressed by the beauty, majesty, and seeming magic of the service, and she observed that the abbey itself seemed suspended in a haze of wonder. As the coronation ritual stretched on and on, however, she became impatient. "The service got rather boring as it was all prayers," she later wrote. Anxious to know when it would be over, she quietly flipped through her program. She then discreetly nudged Queen Mary and pointed out the word finis, meaning the end in Latin, on the last page of her program, and she and her grandmother smiled conspiratorially at one another. The following year, Elizabeth began to attend private classes at Eton College with the Vice Provost, Sir Henry Martin. In order to prepare her for her future role as Queen, she studied constitutional law and the history of the monarchy. Martin emphasized strongly that the secret of a successful monarchy is adaptability. He pointed to the ongoing collapse of ancient royal houses and asserted that the British monarchy had largely forestalled a similar fate by drawing back the curtain of mystery, allowing themselves to become more accessible to the public and by being receptive to public opinion. This contrasted with France, where an aloof and largely uncaring royal establishment in the 18th century had been brought to a shuddering and ultimately bloody end with the French Revolution. By way of contrast, Elizabeth's grandfather, King George V, cognizant of the anti-German sentiment among the people during the First World War years, changed the royal family's name by proclamation in 1917 from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor. While this did nothing to erase the king's heritage or make people forget the fact that Kaiser Wilhelm was, in fact, his first cousin, it was a powerful statement of King George V's identity as a British king, a leader and defender of his people. Another key aspect of Sir Henry Martin's instruction was his emphasis on the importance of broadcasting, which, since the reign of George V, has remained one of the primary means the royal family uses to connect with the public, from radio in George's time to television speeches, interviews, and in-depth documentary films in more recent decades. When their father ascended the throne, Elizabeth and Margaret were still very young, and because of their dramatic status change, they were now destined to live their lives in an even more rarefied atmosphere than the one into which they had been born. There was concern within the family that, in consequence, the girls might become even more isolated. Bertie's younger sister, Princess Mary, who was honorary president of the Girl Guides, suggested they might like to join a guide troupe. There were, of course, major issues with this proposal, similar to the ones that had prevented the princesses from attending school. How could their security be ensured without restricting their experience? Would they be accepted in a cooperative, egalitarian group like the Girl Guides, in light of who they were? Would any accommodations to the princesses be viewed as preferential treatment? Finally, it was decided that a special troupe would be formed consisting of relatives and the daughters of the aristocracy. Margaret, who was not yet old enough for the Girl Guides, was admitted to the troupe as a brownie. 20 girls, roughly Elizabeth's age, met regularly at Buckingham Palace, beginning in 1937. They went on treks and explorations within the palace's extensive grounds, earned merit, badges, and cooked sausages over an open fire. In later years, Elizabeth would speak warmly and nostalgically of her experience as a Girl Guide, and she continued to support the organization and its values throughout her long reign. During the summer of 1939, the King and Queen, accompanied by their daughters, paid a visit to the Royal Naval College. It was there that Elizabeth met Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark for the first time. Philip was her distant cousin and also a descendant of Queen Victoria. He had been named Best Cadet during his first year at Dartmouth. He was outgoing, funny, and already rather sophisticated at 18 years old. He received the King and Queen warmly and played with Elizabeth and Margaret during their visit. Elizabeth admired his confidence and handsomeness a great deal, but she was just 13 and still had her braces on. It would be quite a few years before Philip would come to see her as a young woman rather than a child. Philip's uncle and closest male mentor, Louis Mountbatten, Bertie's cousin, was especially eager to encourage ongoing interactions between his nephew and the future queen, seemingly anxious to have some influence over the next generation of royals. Throughout 1938 and 1939, London began to transform in anticipation of a potential war with Germany, as the Nazis became ever more aggressive in their pursuit of land in Central Europe, annexing Austria first, then the Sudetenland, and finally Czechoslovakia. Anti-aircraft batteries were installed, bomb shelters were constructed, and gas masks were issued to tense and dismayed citizens. When war was finally declared in September 1939, Elizabeth and Margaret began to listen as closely to the wireless as the rest of the British public, hoping for good news. Crawford read them the newspapers daily, but she made efforts to edit out whatever she believed to be too shocking. Elizabeth, in turn, tried to shield Margaret from news and information about the war that she thought would upset her. Elizabeth was encouraged to try to continue as normal, but she was as eager to contribute to the war effort and do her bit in the unfolding crisis as were many young people of her generation. She and Margaret organised weekly sewing parties in their schoolroom during the fall of 1939 and the spring of 1940 to produce goods for the war effort. The King and Queen insisted that they and their daughters should follow the rationing requirements, although they still enjoyed the privileges of having game from their own estate and fresh produce from the gardens. During the autumn of 1940, the princesses were secretly sent to live at Windsor Castle for the duration of the war, since it was the most well-defended royal residence. This was in keeping with government policy, which saw London emptied of the vast majority of its children and elderly people during the Blitz. The bombing campaign by the Germans between the autumn of 1940 and the early summer of 1941. Bertie and Elizabeth made an effort to spend as many weekends as possible at Windsor, but because they remained at Buckingham Palace for most of the week, it was a worrisome and confining adjustment for two young girls. There were blackout curtains at every window, lights were kept as low as possible, and a small group of carefully chosen soldiers stood guard, ready to take the princesses to an undisclosed safe house should an attack occur. The British media, as anxious as the government to protect the princesses, made no effort to uncover or expose their whereabouts. Newspapers reported only that they were safe and staying at an undisclosed location somewhere in the country. For 5 years, Elizabeth and Margaret tried to carry on as normal, attending to their lessons daily. But there were now all kinds of new and frightening realities to confront, including preparation for air raids. They tried to distract themselves by exploring the castle and playing hide and seek. The staff tried to keep them as occupied as possible and treated them kindly. They invited the princesses to tea parties with cakes and biscuits baked by the mothers and sisters of the guards. And the king's librarian took them down to the underground vaults of Windsor Castle to see the crown jewels. Knowing the Nazis' reputation for plundering cities like Vienna and Paris that they had conquered, these historic treasures had been hidden from potential invaders, along with innumerable other important artifacts and pieces of art from British museums and galleries. The British newspapers praised the fortitude of the princesses in their isolated life, noting that they obeyed rationing, kept their gas masks clean and near at hand, and planted a victory garden in which they grew fresh vegetables for themselves. The Blitz began across southern England during the summer of 1940. Like the rest of the people of London, who found it near impossible to sleep during the bombings, Elizabeth and Margaret tried to stay calm during air raids. They would hurry down into the dungeons of Windsor Castle and try to distract themselves by reading, singing, or telling stories. By the end of the war, the Germans had dropped no less than 300 bombs around the Great Park of Windsor Castle, just a small fraction of the tens of thousands of bombs which rained down across England during the conflict. On the 13th of October 1940, 14-year-old Elizabeth gave her first public speech on the wireless during Children's Hour on the BBC, in which she offered comfort and encouragement to all of the children displaced by the war. The future Queen stated, "We know, every one of us, that in the end all will be well, for God will care for us and give us victory and peace. And when peace comes, remember it will be for us, the children of today, to make the world of tomorrow a better and happier place. My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say goodnight to you. Come on, Margaret." Then came Margaret's higher and unmistakable younger tone. "Good night, children." The broadcast was an international sensation, particularly in North America, where many British evacuees were sheltering. Hundreds of schools and churches throughout the United States and Canada installed wireless technology just to hear the princess's speech, and the BBC received numerous requests to repeat the broadcast. London may have been devastated by the Blitz, but Hitler had utterly failed to weaken British morale, and he then foolishly began to turn his attention to Russia, believing that Britain would soon decide to negotiate peace terms with the Nazis. He was wrong. It was during the last few years of World War II that Elizabeth came of age and began to assert her independence. This assertion was more subtle in Elizabeth than in other young women. She was, overall, dutiful and eager to please her parents, but she nonetheless had her own convictions and a will of her own. Bertie and Elizabeth were not keen to see their daughter grow up too quickly. Above all, they wanted to forestall the moment when their family, us four, would be separated. From a public relations standpoint, both the royal establishment and the media continued to treat and portray Elizabeth as a child. Even at age 16 or 17, Elizabeth might still be dressed in an outfit that matched Margaret's, who was over 4 years younger. Elizabeth also continued to live in the nursery wing and complete her lessons daily with Crawfie. It was not until her 18th birthday that she was finally given her own suite of rooms outside of the nursery. In anticipation of her future role as queen, she was also made a councillor of state. Her parents began to give her more royal duties, including giving speeches at public functions and serving in charitable organisations. However, for Elizabeth, this was not enough. Having come of age in the midst of a calamitous war, she was, like many members of her generation, highly practical. She and Margaret had covertly and longingly watched debutante balls as children, but much as she had looked forward to a more traditional entry to adulthood, the current crisis was so much more important. Like others who grew up during the war, she was a strong believer in fairness and collective responsibility, and she yearned to play a greater part in the war effort. "I ought to do as other girls of my age do," she said. Many of her young, aristocratic cousins were already doing their bit for the country, fighting in the field, caring for the sick and wounded in hospitals, and working in transportation or logistics for the war effort. Elizabeth wanted to play her part also. So, when she turned 16 in April 1942, she promptly signed on at the Labour Exchange, but was not offered work. It is unclear why. Her status may well have been seen as a potentially problematic distraction, but the king's influence may also have played a part. Finally, a month before her 19th birthday, Elizabeth was permitted to join the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army. Elizabeth's service in the ATS was viewed by many as highly effective propaganda and a morale booster for the British. But the princess's experience of service was very different. It was the only time I had been able to test myself against people of the same age, she said later. In March of 1945, Elizabeth began training as a driver and a mechanic. She worked hard and eventually became adept at the job, able to disassemble and reassemble an engine quickly and successfully. And yet, like her Girl Guide troupe, a certain amount of authentic experience remained out of her reach. Quote-unquote normal interactions were made extraordinarily difficult simply because of who she was. Moreover, Bertie only finally allowed his daughter to enlist when he knew that the war would be over in mere weeks, with victory assured when the German campaign in the east against the Soviet Union had failed and new fronts were opened in southern and Western Europe. Elizabeth was not the sort to confront or fight, but she had a quiet determination to assert her independence and to be her own person. This is most apparent in her choice to marry Prince Philip, which was probably the first decision she ever made without consulting her parents. While Elizabeth remained at Windsor Castle throughout the war, Philip's naval service took him to the Mediterranean and the Pacific. He continued to write to Elizabeth and visited the royal family several times throughout the duration of the war when he was on leave. Elizabeth seemed to fall more and more in love with him each time he visited. While Philip was flattered by the young princess's attention, he still mostly saw her as a child. Yet he was very fond of her, as he was fond of her whole family. Bertie, Elizabeth, and their daughters had a closeness that was very attractive to Philip, who had spent much of his childhood lonely and separated from his own family. He was invited to spend Christmas with the Windsors in 1943, and Elizabeth bustled excitedly around the nursery. "You know who's coming this Christmas, don't you, Crawfie?" she asked happily. After another stay at the palace during the summer of 1944, Philip appeared to change his mind about Elizabeth. The two were very different people, but that was perhaps part of the attraction. He was sophisticated, opinionated, and often painfully irreverent, whereas she was innocent and demure. But she was also unfailingly faithful, dependable, and honest as few people in his life had been. And Elizabeth may have found Philip's tendency towards plain speaking refreshing. He certainly said and did things that Elizabeth could not, but perhaps sometimes wished to. Following Philip's visit, his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, known affectionately to the royal family as Dickie, promptly broached the subject of Philip's marriage to Elizabeth with the King and Queen. Bertie and Elizabeth initially had numerous reservations about Philip, particularly regarding his temperament, his reputed way with women, his rebelliousness, and his family's partial German heritage. Additionally, they believed that Elizabeth, at 18, was still too young to be betrothed. Lord Mountbatten subsequently approached other courtiers and politicians to advocate for his nephew's suit. Elizabeth did not display any outward resentment, that her parents were lukewarm about her relationship with Philip, but neither did she hide her feelings from her family or household. Crawfie later wrote that the princess kept a picture of Prince Philip displayed in her sitting room. When Crawfie inquired whether it was wise to do so, as anyone who saw it might begin to gossip and speculate, Elizabeth realized her governess was right and put the picture away, replacing it instead with a photograph of the prince with a thick and unruly beard. "There," she said, satisfied. "I defy anyone to recognize who that is." Victory in Europe Day, on the 8th of May 1945, saw greater crowds in the streets of London than anyone had ever seen before. Multitudes stood outside Buckingham Palace, cheering and calling for the royal family to emerge onto the balcony. "We want the king," they chanted. Elizabeth stood with her parents, Margaret and Prime Minister Winston Churchill, proudly wearing her ATS uniform and waving to the cheering crowds. That evening, in a burst of high spirits, the royal family went out onto the streets of London to join the dancing and celebrating that seemed to be going on everywhere. Elizabeth and Margaret repeated their outing together the next night as well. "We walked for simply miles," Elizabeth wrote in her diary, through Trafalgar Square, Piccadilly, Pall Mall. The two sisters, who had grown up so sheltered, joined their fellows before the gates of Buckingham Palace after midnight to cheer for their parents, the King and Queen, who waved from the balcony. the evidence everywhere in London of the ravages of war was as heartbreaking to Elizabeth and Margaret as to the rest of the city. And yet they walked, cheered, sang, and danced with other young Londoners who, like the princesses, had shed their childhood in a time of war. Such was the sense of unification among the Second World War generation, when what seemed then like the greatest struggle in history came to an end. By 1946, with the war over and England returning to some form of normality, Elizabeth had established a more adult routine. Each morning, she was awakened by Bobo, now the princess's dresser, rather than her nanny, who helped her get ready for the day. She attended to her correspondence and her obligations to her various charities, and attended royal council meetings. She now had her own independent household in Buckingham Palace, including her own receiving rooms for palace business, 2 ladies-in-waiting, a footman, and a housemaid. She was also finally permitted to choose her own clothes and decided what fashions she preferred. The Depression and the war had had their impact on fashion. Rationing meant that each person was limited to 1 outfit per year, and the struggles of the times made ostentatious dress seem vulgar and disrespectful. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had taken care to dress her daughters respectably, but simply, and the public admired that she often made over some of her own garments to clothe the girls. Therefore, when Lilibet came of age, she unsurprisingly showed little interest in high fashion and seemed to prefer an elegant but modest and traditional look. Besides, she was a countrywoman at heart and was much more comfortable in clothes that were functional. It is therefore ironic that, as queen, she would ultimately prove to be an international fashion icon. The unique outfits created by her personal staff were designed to be as distinctive and memorable as possible. Throughout her tenure as queen, she grew to appreciate the art and artistry of fashion, and loved the bright colours and occasionally avant-garde ensembles that were chosen for her. These amazing outfits certainly made it difficult to lose the queen in a crowd. During a visit to Balmoral during the summer of 1946, Philip proposed to Elizabeth, and she accepted. Her father, the king, however, insisted they wait until after Elizabeth's 21st birthday, the following spring, to announce the engagement. Some historians speculate that this may have been a strategy to try and keep them apart long enough for one or both of them to lose interest. Perhaps Bertie was simply reluctant to let his beloved Lilibet go just yet. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth took their daughters with them on a state visit to South Africa in the spring of 1947. During this, Elizabeth was warmly and enthusiastically received by the crowds who came out to greet the royal family. The 21st of April 1947 was Elizabeth's 21st birthday. It was declared a national holiday, and a great ball was held in her honour at Cape Town. Earlier that afternoon, she gave a historic speech which was broadcast all over the empire, composed by Sir Alan Lascelles. When Elizabeth first read it, tears reportedly filled her eyes. "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service, and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. But I shall not have the strength to carry out this resolution alone, unless you join in it with me, as I now invite you to do. I know that your support will be unfailingly given. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it." The royal family returned to London early in the summer of 1947. Elizabeth and Philip's several months of separation had seemingly had no impact on their determination to marry. In the weeks following her return, she was often seen out and about with Philip in the passenger seat of his black MG sports car. On the 8th of July, they announced their engagement. The prospect of having a full-blown and public royal wedding was something of a public relations gamble during the immediate post-war period. On the one hand, it might bolster British morale at a time when rationing was still in force and the economy was still recovering from the long war effort. But conversely, the expense of a royal wedding could be perceived as totally out of touch with the difficult economic situation confronting the country. In the end, the British public seemed excited at the prospect of a royal wedding. Numerous ordinary citizens and well-wishers donated their clothing ration coupons to help produce the bride's wedding dress, which was designed by Norman Hartnell in ivory satin, with a 15-foot train, with the white roses of York painstakingly stitched in pearls. Prior to their wedding, Philip renounced his German surname and his Greek and Danish titles, becoming simply Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, King George VI then admitted Philip into the Order of the Garter, reserved for the closest and most trusted companions to the sovereign, and conferred on him the title of His Royal Highness, Duke of Edinburgh. On the 20th of November 1947, Elizabeth and Philip were finally married with great celebration at Westminster Abbey. From all over the world, the couple received over 10,000 congratulatory telegrams and nearly 3,000 wedding gifts. 2,000 people attended a public reception just to see the couple's wedding gifts displayed. The next few years were happy and contented ones for Elizabeth and Philip. The king gifted them with the royal residence of Clarence House next to St. James's Palace, and the newlyweds spent time renovating and improving it for themselves and their growing family. On the 14th of November 1948, just 6 days before their first wedding anniversary, Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, Prince Charles. The following year, on the 15th of August, she and Philip were blessed again, this time with a daughter, Princess Anne. Beginning in 1948, Philip was stationed in Malta, and despite the birth of 2 children and her royal duties and responsibilities, Elizabeth tended to give priority to being at her husband's side during the early years of her marriage, even if her children remained in England. Charles took his first steps without either of his parents there to witness the milestone, just as Elizabeth had spoken her first word with only Mrs. Knight, Bobo, and Ruby to tell the tale. Elizabeth made efforts to spend at least an hour with her children every morning and at least another hour between bath time and bedtime. When they did not accompany their parents abroad, Charles and Anne were left in the care of their nannies at Clarence House or stayed with their grandparents, the King and Queen, when they went to Sandringham. While some have criticised Queen Elizabeth for this approach to motherhood, it is worth noting that her own mother and father had parented Elizabeth and Margaret in much the same way and still considered themselves a close family. In 1950, Marion Crawford published The Little Princesses to the shock and dismay of the entire royal family. Crawford had remained one of Lilibet's closest confidants, even after her retirement as governess in 1947. Ms. Crawford had approached Queen Elizabeth for permission to publish the memoir, and the Queen had refused, horrified by the notion. The publication went ahead regardless and became an immediate bestseller, netting over $75,000. The Windsors felt utterly betrayed. They severed all ties with Ms. Crawford and never communicated with her again. From then on, the royal family would refer to anyone who wrote a royal memoir as doing a Crawford. By the standards of the modern tell-all memoir, The Little Princesses is an overwhelmingly idealized, sentimental and flattering portrait of 2 children Marion Crawford, obviously loved dearly following her long years working with them. But in 1950, it seemed to be a gross and vulgar violation of the royal family's privacy, and a betrayal of the trust they had placed in their children's beloved governess. Since then, the royal family has had many more people who have worked closely with them, do a Crawford, and sharing human and relatable details about the royal family has become increasingly less objectionable over time. The royal family themselves have done so several times since the 1970s. Queen Elizabeth permitted the creation of 2 family documentaries, allowing camera crews and production staff into royal residences. Several biographies of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip were published during their lifetimes, particularly so from the 1990s onwards. By 1951, it became clear that Elizabeth and Philip's rather carefree days as a married couple would be coming to an end sooner than expected. The health of King George VI was precarious. He had contracted lung cancer after years of chronic smoking, forcing his doctors to remove one of his lungs, and he suffered from various associated ailments. Elizabeth and Philip had to take on far more royal duties during the king's illness, and finally, Philip was forced to give up his naval career. In October, they departed for a royal tour of the United States and Canada on the king's behalf. In January of 1952, they undertook another major tour, the first stop on which was Kenya. Bertie saw his daughter and son-in-law off at the airport. It was the last time he would see Elizabeth. King George VI, known to his family as Bertie, died quietly in his sleep a week later. It was dawn in Nyeri, Kenya, and Elizabeth was up early, watching the sunrise at a lookout point at the famed Treetops Hotel. Speaking years later to a biographer, former royal equerry Mike Parker described a moment of peace and wonder that morning, when a magnificent eagle appeared and hovered above them. "I never thought about it until later," he said, "but That was roughly the time when the king died. Elizabeth's private secretary, Martin Chartres, heard the news about the king's death at a local hotel. He quickly telephoned Mike Parker at Sagana Lodge, where Elizabeth and Philip were staying, and asked him to inform the new queen of what had happened. Parker, who couldn't bear to tell her, asked Philip to speak to her instead. Philip took his wife into the garden to give her the terrible news. Elizabeth appeared to pace up and down the garden agitatedly, but when she came back, inside, she was calm. She apologized to her staff for the lack of notice, but said they would have to leave as soon as possible. By the time Chartres arrived, her face was flushed, but she was otherwise composed, writing letters of apology for the abrupt end to the tour and the necessity of cancelling multiple engagements. Before they departed, Chartres asked her what regnal name she would choose. Sovereigns often choose a name that shows continuity with the past, or reverence for a certain line of rulers. Elizabeth preferred to keep things simpler. When asked what her regnal name would be, she replied, "My own name, Elizabeth, of course. What else?" It was a fitting beginning to the straightforward, no-nonsense reign of Queen Elizabeth II. When Elizabeth returned to London in February 1952, her grandmother, Queen Mary, promptly paid her a visit at Clarence House, insisting that she, her old granny and subject, must be the first to kiss her hand. Elizabeth was shocked and deeply affected by the reverence, and it brought home the reality of her new position to her even more forcefully. The next morning, she addressed the Accession Council at St. James's Palace, affirming in her speech her desire to serve dutifully. When her father had been crowned king, he had been hailed as both king and emperor, but in light of the ongoing collapse of Britain's colonial empire, his daughter was styled Queen of the United Kingdom, the head of the Commonwealth, and queen of her other realms and territories. This distinction is not necessarily immediately apparent, but it was an important one, signifying that the British monarch was no longer the ruler of an empire, but an honorary queen of individual dominions, which would each have the right to decide their own degree of affiliation and commitment to the Commonwealth. A little over a year later, on the 2nd of June 1952, Elizabeth's coronation was held in Westminster Abbey. In a notable break with precedent, it was the first time that a coronation for a British sovereign had ever been broadcast live. Officials had reacted with horror in previous decades to the notion of allowing full public consumption of such momentous events in Westminster Abbey. A live broadcast had been suggested for the coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth in 1937, but the Archbishop of Canterbury had hotly rejected the proposition, claiming that ordinary people could not be trusted to show the proper reverence. The Archbishop was particularly disturbed at the idea that people might be able to listen to the sacred service while drinking in their local pub and with their hats on. The Duke of Edinburgh, who chaired the planning committee, was strongly in favour of televising the coronation, making the monarch more accessible to the people in a modern way. The committee finally agreed, but insisted that the camera pan away from the ceremony during the anointing and communion. Elizabeth wore an exquisite ivory satin gown, which, according to her instructions, was minutely embroidered with the floral emblems of every country in the Commonwealth. After taking the coronation oath, she was anointed, invested with regalia, and crowned to cheers of "God Save the Queen." The crowds outside the Abbey erupted in celebration, and millions of people across Britain who were watching the event on television cheered along with them. Thousands of households and businesses had purchased or rented television sets just to see the coronation. From the point that she ascended the throne in 1952, the central challenge of Queen Elizabeth's life was to keep personal and family life firmly compartmentalized from her life and duty as the monarch. Unfortunately, this proved to be an immensely difficult goal to achieve, and was no doubt the cause of great pain and regret to her over the years, because her duty as queen had to always come first. Because of her unique position, she could rarely express her opinions for fear of potentially sparking a constitutional crisis. She had to be endlessly diplomatic. During the decades following her accession, the monarchy faced successive challenges, including public interrogations of its cost to taxpayers and questions about its real utility in the modern world. In addition, public fascination with scandals within the personal lives of the royal family threatened to undermine their legitimacy. The late Queen was often praised for the manner in which she approached these crises, with her first priority being her position as head of state of the church and the commonwealth. Others criticized her approach to her family's personal struggles and asserted that she could have been a better mother to her children or a better sister to Margaret, even if that meant potentially compromising her duty as queen. After her sister's coronation, Princess Margaret was waiting for her carriage in front of the abbey when a photographer noticed her picking a piece of lint off a man's jacket, that of her father's equerry, Group Captain Peter Townsend. Before long, speculation about their relationship developed into a media frenzy. Elizabeth was reportedly sympathetic to her sister's situation and wished for her to be happy. She had never liked taking sides, so she did not initially encourage or discourage Margaret in her relationship with Townsend. Unfortunately, Townsend was divorced and his wife was still living, and therefore the Anglican Church would not consent to marry them. Moreover, Margaret was third in line to the throne, and the shadow of the abdication still loomed large in the early post-war period. The royal family, and those who worked most closely with them, asked the couple to delay a formal engagement, perhaps hoping that their feelings for one another would wane. Sadly, they did not, and rather than forfeit her title, her income, or be forced to live abroad, Margaret and Peter mutually called off their engagement. Several years later, Princess Margaret married the photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, with whom she had 2 children, Sarah and David. The couple divorced in 1976. Things were chilly, not only between the Queen and her sister in the early years of her reign, but seemingly between herself and her husband also. Philip had not adjusted well to being the husband of the Queen of England. Having to give up his naval career had been a bitter disappointment, and he found the endless round of royal duties, of ribbon cutting, handshaking and speech-making, extraordinarily tiresome. He was accustomed to a much more active life, and it was difficult for him to adjust to being a supporting act for the Queen. By 1957, American newspapers began to gossip about Philip and the supposedly questionable company he kept at the Thursday Club, a men's lunch club featuring a who's who of politics, finance, and the arts in Soho. Rumours of indiscreet behaviour by Philip and those accompanying him on the 1957 royal tour began to spread also. The palace denied the rumours. Eventually, Philip did manage to carve out a niche for himself and settle into his royal duties. An endlessly curious and adventurous man, he remained particularly interested in being a patron for science, technology, sports, and education initiatives. In 1957, Elizabeth made him a Prince of the United Kingdom through letters patent to thank him for his service to the Crown and the Commonwealth. He was not given the title of King Consort or Prince Consort due to overwhelming political opposition. Elizabeth's position as a female monarch was by no means unprecedented, but it was still a delicate one, especially in light of her wedding vows to love, honour and obey her husband, which was still the conventional wording in the middle of the 20th century. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip eventually developed into a cohesive and effective team, and she described him on multiple occasions during their lifetimes as her strength and stay. The decades they faced together certainly did call for both strength and stability. The royal couple welcomed 2 more children in the next few years. Prince Andrew was born on the 19th of February 1960, and Prince Edward 4 years later on the 10th of March 1964. Prince Philip was firm in his insistence that their children be permitted to go to senior school with ordinary young people. Charles, Andrew and Edward attended their father's alma mater, Gordonstoun in Scotland, and Anne attended Benenden School in Kent. They grew up nowhere near as sheltered as their mother had, and as a result grew into more worldly young adults than Elizabeth had been when she first entered her adult years. There has been a great deal of disagreement among observers and biographers about the Queen's performance as a mother. Charles collaborated in a biographical publication during the early 1990s, which sometimes painted Elizabeth as cold and distant, and at other times affectionate, but not enough inclined to interfere when she should. The impression was given that as a result, her children were all rather lost. Some biographers disagree with this perspective, pointing out that Elizabeth, despite the rigours of her position, spent as much, if not more time with her children than most of the aristocratic women of her acquaintance. Speaking to a royal biographer in the early 2000s, all that Prince Philip would say for the record was, "We did our best." The 1960s saw the beginning of an unprecedented increase in criticism and satire directed at the monarchy. Only a few years earlier, making fun of members of parliament or the royal family in public would have been viewed as shamefully disrespectful. But by the 60s, British comedians regularly began to poke fun at their political elites, especially comedians with Republican or progressive leanings, and British newspapers were far less reticent about publishing items injurious to their authority. Figures. In 1969, Prince Philip gave an interview on American television lamenting the financial situation of the royal family. His references to the exorbitantly expensive upkeep of palaces and yachts fell flat and were perceived as totally out of touch in a Britain which still had not achieved a full economic recovery from the Second World War. Commentators began to look much more closely at the royal family's income from the civil list payments and the cost to the taxpayer. There was increased scrutiny of the fact that the Queen paid no estate or income tax and was not required to disclose any details about her private fortune or finances. At the time, the Queen's personal fortune was probably not more than $12,000. Her personal fortune, however, grew much greater. She inherited approximately $70,000 from the Queen Mother's estate in 2002, but what her total net worth was is difficult to calculate because many royal resources such as residences, artifacts, and regalia actually belong to the nation. In the early 1990s, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip announced that they would begin paying taxes on their personal income. In the 1970s, the royal family began to work with younger and more modern press officials, and new innovations were introduced to increase public accessibility to the monarchy. The Royal Walkabout was first introduced during a royal visit to Australia, during which the Queen undertook a street visit that was not on the official itinerary to meet people, shake hands with them, and chat a little. The public responded warmly and positively to the practice, and it became a permanent and regular event during royal visits all over the world. In 1977, Queen Elizabeth marked 25 years on the throne with her Silver Jubilee celebrations. The City of London hosted more than 6,000 street parties. The Queen's popularity had remained consistently high, despite greater expectations of accountability from the public. The Queen made a very successful visit to Northern Ireland, which was encouraging considering the region had been embroiled in sectarian conflict since the late 1960s. But the Northern Ireland troubles struck much closer to home during the next few years and were the first in a fairly rapid succession of dangerous incidents that put the safety of the royal family and those who served them at risk. In 1979, Lord Mountbatten and his grandson were killed in a bombing in Ireland, for which the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, claimed responsibility. Similarly deadly attacks were carried out on several of the Queen's household cavalry and military. Musicians at Hyde Park in London in 1982. At the annual Trooping of the Colour ceremony celebrating the Queen's birthday in 1981, 17-year-old Marcus Sargent fired 6 shots at the Queen, which thankfully turned out to be blanks. Mounted side saddle on her horse Burmese, Elizabeth was startled, but she recovered quickly enough to effectively soothe her horse, and the public admired her grace under pressure. Only months later, on a visit to Dunedin, New Zealand, 17-year-old Christopher Lewis tried to shoot the Queen with a rifle from the 5th floor of a building overlooking a parade in her honour. Thankfully, he missed. Both of these would-be assassins faced charges and jail time. The security of Buckingham Palace itself was called into question in July of 1982, when it was revealed that a man named Michael Fagan had somehow managed, without any sort of special equipment or ability, to breach the palace's defences, travel through the corridors unseen, and then walk right into the Queen's bedroom. Multiple and differing accounts of this event exist, so exactly what happened is still somewhat unclear, but apparently Fagan simply walked in and opened the Queen's curtains. Startled by the intruder, she reportedly pressed the button next to her bed to summon her staff, but the bell was either broken or simply went unheard. It seems she managed to slip out of the bedroom while Fagan was looking around for a cigarette lighter. There was fascinated speculation that the two might have even had a conversation, as some believed that Fagan had been in the Queen's bedroom for as long as 10 minutes. Fagan, however, speaking to several newspapers years later, denied that they discussed anything, stating that the Queen had simply run out of the room at the first opportunity. Such threats to her safety were a reality that Queen Elizabeth had to face quite frequently throughout her life. But commendably, it did not curb her willingness to remain accessible to the public. She continued to perform her royal duties very much in the open. Protecting the Queen during her walkabouts, for example, was ultimately very difficult, but Elizabeth refused to be intimidated. She was also determined to preserve a sphere of privacy and comfort for herself and her family, and traditionally opposed measures that threatened to violate it. Queen Elizabeth worked with no fewer than 14 prime ministers, but the Thatcher years were particularly interesting for her from a political standpoint. Margaret Thatcher was not just Britain's first female prime minister, but she was also the first Elizabeth had worked with who was her own age. One might imagine that this political relationship would have been among the Queen's most harmonious and successful, but multiple biographers and historians believe that it was not. The Queen was far too devoted to constitutional norms ever to break the confidentiality of her weekly meetings with Britain's top elected official, or to criticize a prime minister openly, which she never did. Historians speculate that the strongest division between the two women may have emerged over Thatcher's reluctance to approve the recommendation of sanctions against South Africa to encourage the abolition of apartheid, to which the Queen was deeply committed. According to former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, Queen Elizabeth was highly active behind the scenes in encouraging international support for an end to the oppressive apartheid government in South Africa. Despite the numerous challenges she had faced as both a mother and a queen, these challenges reached something of a crescendo during the 1990s. A new decade had brought increased criticism of the younger members of the royal family, and the Queen was increasingly satirized in television programs. True to form, she attempted to fight fire with fire by making another documentary film, Elizabeth R., for which she allowed cameras to follow her about for nearly a year while she provided the commentary. The film premiered in 1992, the same year which the Queen once dubbed in a famous speech at London's Guildhall, her annus horribilis, or horrible year. The reasons for her lamenting 1992 are all too well known. The marriages of 3 out of 4 of her children fell apart in 1992, and a disastrous fire at Windsor Castle caused $60,000 in damages to her childhood home. In March of the following year, the Queen's former nanny, Margaret Bobo MacDonald, her confidant and closest friend, passed away at the age of 89. She had been by Elizabeth's side for 67 years, continuing to serve as her dresser when the young princess moved out of her nursery. Elizabeth was deeply saddened by Bobo's passing. Yet another terrible blow struck the royal family. In 1997, when Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in a car crash in Paris. At the time of the accident, Elizabeth and Philip were at Balmoral with Charles's and Diana's sons, William and Harry, to whom they now had to explain the terrible reality of their mother's death. The nation, and many more people around the world, mourned Diana's passing. She had been widely popular and much beloved for her philanthropy and empathetic kindness, and an impromptu shrine consisting of thousands of cards, flowers, and tokens of sympathy accumulated in front of Buckingham Palace in the following days. The newspapers began to question why there was no flag flying at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, why the Queen had not addressed the nation, and why the royal family did not seem to be mourning Diana's death with any visibility. There was a fundamental disconnect at work here. What the public wanted was a show of emotion. What the Queen wanted was to protect her devastated grandsons and allow them and the rest of the family to mourn privately. But because Diana's separation from the royal family had been so acrimonious, the Queen understood that something more was required to validate the very genuine public mourning. Elizabeth acquiesced, returning to London and giving a live broadcast, the day before Diana's funeral, expressing her admiration for her daughter-in-law and the family's grief at her passing. Public approval of the Queen reached its lowest point in 1997, but soon rebounded significantly. Elizabeth confronted 2 more terrible losses in 2002. In February, her sister Margaret passed away at the age of 71, and the Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, died just 1 month later at the impressive age of 101. Elizabeth was broken-hearted. As a family, she, Margaret, and their mother had lost Bertie far too soon. But the 3 women had remained an exceptionally close family unit for half a century thereafter. one upon which the Queen had always relied for advice and comfort during her many decades as sovereign. During the same year, the Queen celebrated her Golden Jubilee and 50 years on the throne. Even as she mourned her mother and sister, she reaffirmed the vow of service she had made half a century before. "I am driven by my resolve to continue with the support of my family, to serve the people of this great nation of ours to the best of my ability through the changing times ahead." Indeed, times were certainly changing with regard to what was acceptable within the royal family. In 2005, she gave her blessing for Prince Charles to marry his longtime love, Camilla Parker Bowles, who was subsequently made Duchess of Cornwall. Because both Charles and Camilla were divorced, the couple were married in a civil service, and the Queen and Prince Philip did not attend the ceremony, but they happily attended the reception. As sovereign, Elizabeth was mindful of her position as head of the church, but she understood that times truly had changed considerably during her reign. Few people now expect that members of the royal family should marry anyone other than whom they choose. In a move that speaks even more strongly about letting go of the past, before she died, the Queen expressed her wish that the Duchess be given the title of Queen Consort at Prince Charles's coronation. This represents a major departure from the traditional approach to marriage and divorce within the royal family, especially in light of their long-time affair and Camilla's involvement in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. In 2012, the Queen reached the zenith of her popularity, with incredible approval ratings approaching 90%. That year, she became the only British monarch besides Queen Victoria to celebrate a Diamond Jubilee. And to a riotous reception, she opened the Olympic Games in London with a very special James Bond-themed performance with Daniel Craig, during which she hilariously appeared to parachute out of a plane into the Olympic Stadium. The royal family has seen a re-emergence of criticism and scrutiny during the last decade, some of it surrounding the departure of Elizabeth's grandson, Prince Harry, and his wife, Meghan Markle, from their royal roles, their seeming estrangement from the royal family, and the much-discussed exclusive interview they gave to Oprah Winfrey in March of 2021. Public attention was also drawn to the royal finances with the release of the Paradise Papers. In 2017, it was reported that a sizable proportion of the Queen's wealth from the Duchy of Lancaster rests in offshore tax havens. Different estimates exist of what Her Majesty's net worth was, but it was generally reckoned to be between $500,000 and $600,000. Perhaps most troubling of all to royal supporters and critics alike in more recent years are Prince Andrew's ties to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and the lawsuit for sexual assault launched against him by Virginia Giuffre, which he settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. In January 2022, just months before her death, the Queen stripped her son Prince Andrew of his military titles, as well as all royal duties and patronages, none of which will be returned. In the announcement, it was added that Andrew would face the lawsuit as a private citizen without the support of his family. Despite the reoccurrence of scandal and criticism for members of the royal family, which grieved the Queen in the last years of her life, she remained highly popular both in the United Kingdom and abroad. People all over the world often wrote to her to express their admiration and to express sympathy for her various family dramas, an example of public understanding, which she appreciated. Even at the lowest point of her popularity in 1997, she still had a 70 to 75% approval rating in the UK, as well as in the Old Dominions of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. These are polling results that must be the envy of elected politicians everywhere and are quite impressive considering the length of her tenure as Queen. In 2002, opinion was fairly unanimous among the people of the UK and Britain's Old Dominions. They strongly agreed that the Queen had done a good job as head of state and head of the Commonwealth, but a small majority did not believe that the monarchy would long outlast her. That opinion has not changed much in the last 2 decades, with many people remaining sceptical about the potential success or stability of a monarch other than Queen Elizabeth. Inevitably, the most basic question most people have about the Queen is simply, what was she really like? Philip said that his wife's greatest virtue was her tolerance. He described her as careful, observant, disciplined, and highly moral, but rarely judgmental. Her Majesty's dresser for nearly 30 years, Angela Kelly, wrote of the Queen's courage, kindness, strength, sense of humour, and sense of fun. She apparently had a notable talent for putting people at ease, and was a master at helping those who were a little awed in her presence to relax with a little pleasant small talk. Being the fashion icon that she was, the Queen grew to appreciate beautiful clothes as much as anyone, but she was always most comfortable in riding clothes, practical outdoor shoes or boots, and one of her signature headscarves. The photographs and footage in which Elizabeth appeared to be the most excited, animated and happy were when she was spending time with her dogs and horses, riding or watching horse racing. From the late 1960s onwards, Elizabeth enjoyed pursuing a career breeding and racing horses. She also loved spending time with her family, which has continued to grow following her passing to 8 grandchildren and 12 great-grandchildren. However, she experienced an increasingly solitary time towards the end of her life, following the death of her husband, Prince Philip, in 2021. Indeed, one of the most poignant images of the Queen in the last years of her reign was her sitting, alone in mourning for her dear husband, due to COVID restrictions that were in force at the time, in the pews at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. Even though that was arguably the very worst moment of her life, considering the esteem and affection she had for him, the Queen always placed duty above her personal needs. Unlike many of Britain's politicians, she led by example during the COVID pandemic. In the last few years of her life, she passed along the bulk of her royal duties to Charles, Camilla, her grandson William, and his wife, Catherine Middleton. Queen Elizabeth still cherished her position and duty as head of state and head of the Commonwealth. She would never have abdicated. "It's a job for life," she once remarked. "It's a question of maturing into something that one's got used to doing and accepting the fact that it's your fate, because I think continuity is very important." Some political commentators today are quick to dismiss the monarchy as outdated, needlessly sentimental, and a waste of resources. But others have argued that few, if any, elected politicians could ever hope to exercise the level of soft power that was at the core of the Queen's influence. Soft power refers to the ability to produce desired outcomes using gentle persuasion rather than compulsion or force. Elizabeth embodied British history. She provided a concrete link to her nation's past in the modern world. Further, the Commonwealth continues to play an important role for those countries that choose to belong to it. The association provides access to numerous resources for the further development and betterment of all member nations, and it is through these international partnerships that the Queen was able to concentrate some of her soft power. Commonwealth countries not only share resources and strategies for development, but also cultural, political, and judicial sensibilities. The Commonwealth is one type of tool for preserving international cooperation and friendship, and for the continued promotion of the rule of law, democratic institutions, and both civil and human rights. Elizabeth's reign witnessed a complete redefinition of both monarchy and empire, and in a fascinating paradox, the monarchy became, in many ways, more influential the more its actual power declined. The most popular members of the royal family in the 21st century function as super ambassadors. Politicians and diplomats who might refuse to deal with elected British officials invariably jumped at the chance to meet the Queen, who was called upon many times to encourage political accord by holding a royal event or visit. She left an immense legacy both to the British people and to the wider world, guiding Britain through greater social, political, economic and technological change than perhaps any monarch in history. She also provided leadership, comfort, perspective, stability, and a willingness to make change, whatever her people required of her within constitutional limits. But beyond this, Elizabeth was also a touchstone of global decolonization. Countries and peoples with a painful history of British occupation and colonization came to associate her with the gradual withdrawal from empire, the end of oppression, the beginning of independence and self-governance, and the beginning of international friendship on equal terms. It is worth noting that more than half of Britain's former colonies remain members of the Commonwealth today, and most of those who chose to withdraw still maintain good relations with the UK and have largely favourable approval ratings for the monarchy. All good things come to an end. When Queen Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee was celebrated in February 2022, it was done so with the awareness that it would almost certainly be the last major anniversary of the Queen's accession all the way back in 1952, as by the time the event was held in 2022, she was 95 years of age. As a result, Elizabeth was largely confined to balcony appearances at Buckingham Palace during the event. In the months that followed, her health declined precipitously, not least perhaps because of the loss of her soulmate and much-loved husband, Prince Philip. At this time, Prince Charles and other working royals were increasingly called upon to fill in for her at events. As such, it was perhaps not surprising when the news was released in early September 2022 that the Queen was very ill at her favourite residence, Balmoral in Scotland. In the end, she died faster than many had expected, though Charles and Anne were by her side when she passed on the afternoon of the 8th of September at 96 years of age. Her state funeral was particularly long to accommodate the long lines of people who wished to file by her body as it lay in state at Westminster Abbey throughout mid-September. Finally, on the 19th of September, after a private family ceremony, Queen Elizabeth II was laid to rest in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor Castle, next to her parents and husband. As is the custom with royal succession, Prince Charles succeeded his mother immediately upon her death, becoming King Charles III. He was 73 when he succeeded to the throne in September 2022, making him the oldest person to become monarch of Britain. In line with his mother's wishes, Charles's second wife, Camilla, became his queen consort at his coronation at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May 2023. It was a remarkable occasion in the history of modern Britain, as it was the first royal coronation in over 70 years and only the 6th coronation in the last 200 years. So what kind of monarch will Charles be? His task is not as arduous as it once would have been. If Elizabeth had only lived into her 70s and Charles had become king in the late 1990s or early 2000s, it would have been problematic, given that he was, somewhat unfairly, depicted, in many circles, as the villain in the demise of his marriage to Princess Diana, and public opinion towards the Prince of Wales was very low following Diana's death in 1997. However, with the passage of time, people have warmed again to Charles, and his coronation was warmly greeted. His style of kingship will be different from that of his mother. He believes in a slimmed-down monarchy and will reduce the size of the royal establishment, while he will also try to champion causes that are closer to his heart to a greater extent than Elizabeth did, notably his lifelong advocacy of environmentalism. Charles has been concerned with climate change for decades, and as such, he ascended the throne at just the right moment to be able to champion this cause. Whatever kind of king he is, it will be different from his late mother. It will be a tough act to follow. What do you think of Queen Elizabeth II? Will she go down in history as one of Britain's most dutiful, respected, and revered monarchs? Or was she a silent queen who was too reluctant to voice her opinions on important affairs? And now, our peaceful journey through the Windsor dynasty draws to a close. From George VI's brave wartime leadership to Queen Elizabeth II's unprecedented 7-decade reign that witnessed the transformation of Britain and the Commonwealth, we've gently wandered through a century of extraordinary change together. If you found comfort in tonight's tale, please like, comment your favorite royal moment, and subscribe to keep history whispering you to sleep. Coming soon on Sleepy Crown, we'll begin a new royal adventure exploring another fascinating dynasty that shaped the world. Stay tuned for more soothing tales from the corridors of power and the pages of history. Sleep well, dear listener. May your night be quiet, your dreams kind, and your soul wrapped in peace. Until next time, good night from Sleepy Crown.